So, as we begin our discussion this week on listening, conflict, and climate, I wanted to take the opportunity to focus some attention on a tradition of communication that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the Asia-centric communication tradition, or what we might call an Asian perspective on communication. We've in chapter 2 read about the history of Greek and Roman classical thinkers on through to European university studies of communication and American studies of communication. But we haven't spent much time talking about really other traditions yet. So here's a good opportunity to do so. And the reason I want to do so during this unit is because whereas the European communication tradition emphasizes communication as an act of speaking, right, trying to persuade others with our messages, this is what the Greeks called rhetoric. The Asian communication tradition, on the other hand, emphasizes the act of listening and partaking in group connection. So I think it's going to give us several really great themes to emphasize right now at the beginning of this discussion that will help us think perhaps differently about communication than we do if we are Western thinkers, which I know I am. And so to help me do this, since this doesn't reflect my cultural upbringing, I'm going to be making heavy use of Dr. Yoshitaka Miike, who's a professor of communication at the University of Hawaii. I'm going to be using his work to help me kind of articulate some of the main differences in the kinds of things that each tradition emphasizes. And I'll be using Professor Miike's article here, An Asiacentric Reflection on Eurocentric Bias in Communication Theory. He's going to argue in this 2007 essay that by and large communication studies, especially as it's practiced in the United States, has a very Eurocentric bias in it, and he's going to use the Eurocentric approach to help distinguish what an Asia-centric approach might emphasize instead. And so I want to keep these things in mind throughout our study of communication this semester. So here is some of the 5 main, let's call them themes or ways of thinking about communication and its uses that are emphasized in an Asia-centric approach to communication. And those are using communication to connect yourself with other people and to be a part of the whole of human societies or your own societies. Asia-centric communication is also going to emphasize the use of communication as a way of actually reducing our own ego and our own personal needs, and instead as a way of trying to harmonize with others in our group. Asia-centric communication is also going to emphasize the role of communication and connecting us emotionally to other people. It's going to emphasize the role of affect and emotional convergence, using communication to empathize and understand how others are feeling is going to be emphasized. Fourth, responsibility and reciprocity are emphasized in an Asia-centric approach to communication study. That is, we're going to be looking at communication as a way of receiving your responsibility to the group and being reciprocal having reciprocity and giving back to the group. Finally, Asiacentric communication is going to emphasize the role of communication in moralizing and harmonizing the material and spiritual worlds. And this is, again, an Asia-centric perspective on communication studies. I admit these were new ideas to me not that long ago, and over time I've come to see and understand how important and central these concepts are to the study of communication, especially if we're trying to build relationships with other people and to reduce the kind of violence in our environments. So I'm going to talk about these 5 in greater detail, and to do so, I'm going to switch to this graphic, and this graphic kind of expresses Asia-centric approach to communication as a kind of yang emphasizing communication, and the yang is more of on the receiving side, the listening side, and it's going to show that Eurocentric communication tends to be emphasizing more the yin side of communication, the more speaking side of communication. However, just because each of these traditions is emphasizing one over the other doesn't mean they don't include the other. This is the idea of a dialectic, which actually comes to us from Asian philosophy. A dialectic is different than, say, a binary opposition, which a lot of Western thinking uses binaries. It's different than a binary opposition because the two opposites are still connected as a whole, and that's symbolized with the yin and yang symbol. These are unified oppositions. You can't have one without the other. We're kind of dealing more with degrees of one or the other, or a kind of an eternal pushing and pulling between these two unified yet opposite forces. So we could view communication as involving all of these ideas here. We're just saying that the tradition of Asian communication is going to emphasize the ones on the left, and the European approach will emphasize the ones on the right. So let's start with the top here, connectedness and wholeness, as opposed to the Eurocentric approach of using communication to emphasize our individuality and declare our independence from the group. And I want to go right to the article, and the first highlighted bit of text here deals with, from an Asian perspective then, communication is a process in which we remind ourselves of the interdependence and interrelatedness of the universe. It is an endless process in which we continuously locate and relocate ourselves in an ever-expanding network of relationships across space and time. Constant interaction with fellow humans, nature, and the world of spirits helps us escape the illusion that we are independent individuals at a particular place, at a particular time, and experience the oneness of the universe rather than our individuality. So it's the idea here that's being expressed is using our communication to actually be connected to the whole, as opposed to using it to kind of atomize ourselves into little individuals. Okay. The second theme of Asiacentric communication is the use of communication to reduce our own egos and to harmonize with the group, as opposed to a more European approach, which is going to emphasize a kind of egocentric approach. What needs am I trying to achieve with my communication? How can I use my communication to enhance my own position, my own material wealth, my own well-being, whatever it is? So those are kind of pretty different approaches, let's go back to the text and read what Mike has to say about an Asiacentric perspective in regards to this. Communication is a process in the Asiacentric perspective in which we reduce our selfishness and our egocentrism. Overcoming self-centeredness requires that we continuously interact with others because we rarely cultivate ourselves in isolation. Encountering with fellow human beings, natural beings, and spiritual beings in a way that we reduce our selfishness and egocentrism also fosters our sense of connection and cooperation from an interpersonal level all the way to a cosmological level here. So we're using our communication as a way of becoming more in harmony with and less ego-driven in our communication with others. Let's go back to our graphic here. Asiacentric communication is going to emphasize affect, which is a word that means emotion, and emotional convergence, feeling what others feel. On the other hand, a Eurocentric approach is going to emphasize rationality and reason. And if you've taken Com 101 or Philosophy 101, you're going to know that logic is a very important part of the teaching of public speaking and of the teaching of philosophy. Here's the next one that is, excuse me, this is the emotional convergence being discussed by Mike here. From an Asiacentric perspective, then, communication is a process in which we feel the joy and suffering of all sentient beings. Emotional, not conceptual, convergence plays a pivotal role in Asian communication. This convergence is often possible when the listener, who is ego-decentered and other-directed, attempts to sense and read the emotional dynamics of human interaction. That's a really great description of listening we're getting here. To be communicatively active in the Asian sense, Mike writes, thus is to be perceptive, receptive, and introspective, to feel together with fellow humans, nature, and the spirits. So being much more attuned to a kind of listening process, an empathetic listening process that is emotionally attuned to others. I think this is a really great thing to have in our minds as we're reading about listening this week and conflict resolution. The fourth theme that Asiacentric perspective is going to emphasize is responsibility and reciprocity to the group, as opposed to the Eurocentric approach, which is going to emphasize the right to speak, the right to self-expression, the idea of using communication to defend our freedoms and individuality as well. Here we go. Let's read what Mike has to say about this one. According to the Asian worldview, we must be grateful to our fellow humans, natural environments, and ancestral spirits for our blessings we have an ethical obligation to return something to them because our existence is dependent on other beings. From an Asia-centric perspective, then, communication is a process in which we receive and return our debts to all sentient beings. And that's much different than kind of how I was brought up to think about what communication is used for in a kind of Western democracy. This is not emphasized. Moving on, our final theme that we'll discuss is the use of communication in an Asiacentric tradition to connect with morality and spiritual harmony. And this is opposed to or different from the Eurocentric perspective, which is going to emphasize the use of communication to achieve certain pragmatic social goals, to get things done, and to use communication to be more productive economically and materially, both individually and as a group. Communication is about exchanging goods effectively. Let's read what Mike has to say about this final one. In Asian cultures, generally speaking, communication is positively evaluated when it attempts to actualize the moral integrity and harmony of the universe, and it is negatively evaluated when it aims to pursue our own individual self-interests. Harmony, Mike continues, harmony in Asian communication processes, quote, represents a kind of ethical appeal that can induce a sense of duty for cooperation with the other party, not by the communicator's strategic words, but by the sincere display of wholehearted concern with the other. So morality revolves around harmony from the interpersonal level to the cosmological level. From the Asian perspective, then, communication is a process in which we moralize and harmonize the universe. We're trying to bring our communication to bear in our relationships in a way that creates harmony and reflects the harmony of the universe. This is going to be a lot more spiritual of an approach to the study of communication than we might see in a European or American institution, which generally tends to be materialist and not really talk much about the idea of spiritual harmony or spirits even. So it's not something that I'm used to in my research, talking much about the spirit, but it is something that I'm trying to be more open to as a practitioner of communication and just as a person in the world. So if you have Eurocentric biases like I do, I invite you to try to question those throughout this semester. So those are that's the Asiacentric approach, some of the main differences between that approach and the Eurocentric approach. And I hope that you think about this throughout the week as we're talking about communication in listening, conflict, and the establishment of communication climates.